Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Indigenous peoples and the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda is the topic of an ongoing expert group meeting organized by the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. The meeting is developing strategic guidance and recommendations to mobilize action and support for the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Here with us to talk about the topic are Ms. Joan Carling, an Indigenous activist from the Cordillera region in the Philippines. She is the Secretary General of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. Ms. Carling is a member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and is actively engaged in the process of the 2030 Agenda. We also have with us Mr. Paul Kanyinke Sena, an Indigenous Ogiek from Kenya. He served as the first African chairperson of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues from 2011 to 2013. And we also have with us Ms. Fabiana del Popolo, a population expert from the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. She led the preparation of a 2014 study on guaranteeing Indigenous peoples' rights in Latin America with the substantive advice of Indigenous peoples in the region. Each of the speakers will make brief remarks, then they will take your questions. And I'd like to begin by calling on Ms. Carling. Ms. Carling, you have the floor.
Yeah, good. I don't know if it's morning or afternoon now, but let me first express my appreciation of your presence to this important press conference. One is because the SDG, as it is now, has a lot of implications to Indigenous peoples. And if we look back at the MDG, where Indigenous peoples has been almost invisible, we see a number of progress in the SDG now that it has clear reference to Indigenous peoples and also to the issue of land rights, to human rights, to equity, and the participation in terms of monitoring and review, including Indigenous people. So those are positive aspects, we believe, on the SDG, but learning also from the MDG, it's important to have clear data disaggregation by ethnicity, as well as indicators that will actually reflect the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples. And in this, we believe that the SDG implementation and monitoring should be guided by Indigenous peoples' rights, which are contained in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, as we move forward in the development of indicators, of which I will be participating in the meeting in Bangkok, one of the critical indicator that we want to push that is a multi-purpose indicator is an indicator on the recognition of land rights, because this is critical in addressing poverty, this is critical in addressing hunger, this is critical in gaining equality for Indigenous peoples, and critical on the issue of addressing the overall well-being and sustainable development of Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Carling. I'd like to call on Mr. Sena. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. Is my microphone on? Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'll be very, very brief. As you all know, the Millennium Development Goals did not actually materialize for indigenous communities in the continent. This is mainly because of policies that focused so much resources in high-density areas, hoping that this will have a trickle-down effect to indigenous territories, and consequently this had the opposite effect of marginalizing these areas in most of Africa. But when we look at the SDGs, we see some hope. They are kind of inclusive and provides opportunities that indigenous peoples can use. But of course we also recognize that there are challenges, especially now because of climate change and renewable energy projects, for example, and forestry projects. We see there's a lot of rush to indigenous people's territories, land grabs in Africa. But of course, this can be addressed through law and policy changes that will take into account the Sustainable Development Goals and, of course, the rights of indigenous peoples. But as my colleague has said, disaggregated data would be very, very important in this particular instance. In most of Africa, we still fear talking about ethnicity, and we always like citing Rwanda as a case study of not talking about tribes. But of course, if you look at the opposite of what happened in Kenya, when you don't talk about tribes, people fight. And now in Kenya, we see that there is that move towards actually providing data on the basis of ethnicity. So that actually sets a platform for African states to start disaggregating data on the basis of ethnic groups and indigenous rights. We also see that the SDGs promote partnerships, but we emphasize on the need for right-based approaches, and I call for our African heads of states actually to exercise political will to make sure that the SDGs are realized for indigenous peoples in the continent. And lastly, is to urge the developed nations to kind of put resources into these processes in Africa, the data disaggregation processes, and of course, all other efforts that will be geared towards attainment of the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sena. Ms. Del Popolo, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Here. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning. In ECLAC, especially in my division, the population division, one of the priority area of work is indigenous people's rights. Under this framework, we insist that it's very important to include self-identification of indigenous peoples in all data sources. We work a lot related to census, population census, because we consider that the information is very, it's clue not only as a technical tools, also as a political tools. And indigenous organizations in Latin America frequently demanded for this information. One of our tasks at ECLAC is to develop research and technical reports with policies recommendations to states in order to implement the Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights. In this sense, last year we developed a study, this is the summary of the study, about the situation of indigenous peoples in our region, especially taking into account the last decade, and as a contribution to the process of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. So we work coordinated with the Permanent Forum of Indigenous People that requested the study, in fact. We found that Latin American countries really have made important improvement in the life condition of indigenous peoples, particularly in health or in education. But unfortunately, the gaps between indigenous people and non-indigenous peoples persists, are very deep, so we have an enormous challenge in order to eliminate the inequality and inequity in our regions. So ECLAC encouraged regions, countries to put policies which are based on the human rights indigenous peoples that include, these policies have to include the perspective of indigenous peoples, also their contribution to the region's development, improvement their life condition and respect their territories' rights, and of course we think to build pluricultural democracies that at least benefit all of us. Take into account that in Latin America we have more than 800 indigenous peoples with a tremendous diversity in terms of demographic characteristics, territories, or sociopolitical status. and we have a great challenge. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please. Please introduce yourself, posing your question.
Waldo, Prensa Latina, to Ms. Carlin. Can you share with us which are the main challenge for indigenous people right now? And there is any progress 1 year after the United Nations conference? And to Ms. Fabiana, does ECLAT has specific statistics or data on impact of the poverty, hunger, and unemployed among indigenous people in the region? Thank you very much.
Okay. There are different levels of challenges, I think. When we come to the proposed indicators as it is now, including, the proposed indicators as it is now, there is no single indicator that reflects any of the collective rights of indigenous peoples as such. While there is a target mentioning the access to land, territories, and resources of indigenous peoples, pastoralists, and other local communities, the indicator proposed has no mention at all on indigenous peoples, while the target mentions that. So that's a major problem that we see. And also there are targets, on the other hand, that actually threatens our rights. Like if you look at some targets on energy, targets on industrialization, targets on, there's another target. Anyway, I can't economic growth, right? And if there is no clear indicator to protect our rights, then our lands are subject to land grab for development, for energy development, such as dams, for economic growth, for monocultural production, biofuel plantation. So these are real threats unless there are clear special measures to protect our rights, especially our right to land, territories, and resources, as well as to free, prior, and informed consent. So that is the one that we're trying hard to push, that it should be included in the indicators that will come up, hopefully, to be adopted in March this year. I also wish to flag, I forgot to mention that the issue of land rights is also very significant on the issue of gender equality. Because unless indigenous women are particularly empowered in terms of also having land rights, their vulnerability is much higher compared to women in general, for example, on the issue of human trafficking and violence. So that it will actually will help prevent cases of violence against women if there is also land tenure for indigenous women.
Well, yes, at ECLAC we have a regional indicator system with mainly with sociodemographic indicators disaggregated for indigenous peoples from practically all countries of Latin America. And in the study, we can produce information related to health, to education, and now we are trying to generate information from the service in order to have data about poverty and employment, as you ask. We found, for example, that if the infant mortality rate decreased in all countries, for example, and in average, the infant mortality rate is near 30 per mil borns in Latin America for indigenous people. For non-indigenous people, the rate is 16. So we have a very deaf rate. Gap, sorry. I'm not sure if I say correctly the number of indigenous peoples, more than 800, and 826, 826 different indigenous peoples of Yes, of 45 million indigenous persons. Do you understand the differences?
Yeah.
Yeah? 45 millions of indigenous persons belonging to 826
Distinct people.
these different peoples. Yeah, a lot. A great